The protests filling the streets of cities across Iran are now entering their fourth week. We've seen protests in Iran before, the Green Revolution in 2009 that failed to bring about change, the protests in 2022 after the killing of Masha Amini, the beautiful young woman killed for simply not wearing her hijab in the prescribed way. The protests we're seeing now, though, they feel different. Hello and welcome to the Full Comment Podcast. I'm Brian Lilly, your host, and this week, a look at Iran. The country is facing what appears to be the strongest protest movement since the 1979 revolution that chased the Shah from power and brought about the Islamic Republic. Will this new movement bring about regime change? Will Iranians once again taste freedom? We've got a pair of experts on the matter lined up for you, but first, while reaching people on the ground in Iran is nearly impossible, the regime can still communicate with anyone they want. And last week, the country's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, was on Fox News for a lengthy interview with Bret Baier. He denied the claims that thousands of people, perhaps as many as 12,000, had been killed in the protest by the regime and said, well, the violence was all part of a foreign plot pushed by Israel to draw the United States into attacking Iran.
I'd like to start about the situation on the ground. There are reports, sir, that anywhere from 2,500 to more than 12,000 protesters in various cities have been killed by the regime. How many people have been killed?
Well, thank you, Brett, for having me. Demonstrations started on 28 December, yes, for the economic shortcomings, and for 10 days it was peaceful, and the government engaged with the protesters and with their leaders and tried to solve their problems. Yes, for 10 days it was peaceful, legal demonstrations and protests for economic shortcomings. But after that 10 days, for 3 days, we had completely different story. A terrorist operation, when terrorist elements led from outside, entered these, protests and started to shoot, police forces, police officers and security forces. And there were terrorist cells. They came in. They used Daesh-style terrorist, operations. They got police officers, burned them alive. They beheaded them, and they started shooting at police officers and also to the people. So as a result, for 3 days, we had, in fact, fighting against terrorists and not with the protesters. It was completely a different story. The reason I have to explain, and this is important, why they started to shoot at people, for one reason, they wanted to increase the number of deaths. Why? Because President Trump has said that if there are killings, he would intervene. And they wanted to drag him into this conflict. And that was exactly an Israeli plot.
As preposterous as that seems and sounds, well, that is the official line for the Islamic Republic. American President Donald Trump did warn Iran that the killing must stop and executions couldn't happen, or there would be consequences.
So Iran's in big trouble. It looks to me that the people are taking over certain cities that nobody thought were really possible just a few weeks ago. We're watching the situation very carefully. I've made the statement very strongly that if they start killing people like they have in the past, we will get involved. We'll be hitting them very hard where it hurts. And that doesn't mean boots on the ground, but it means hitting them very, very hard where it hurts.
He even spoke about his team having been in contact with Iranian officials and receiving assurances. In the end, the execution of protesters like 26-year-old Irfan Soltani didn't happen, and that's something the White House did take credit for.
What I will say with respect to Iran is that the president and his team have communicated to the Iranian regime that if the killing continues, there will be grave consequences. And the president received a message, as he revealed to all of you and the whole world yesterday, that the killing and the executions will stop. And the president understands today that 800 executions that were scheduled and supposed to take place yesterday were halted. And so the president and his team are closely monitoring this situation, and all options remain on the table for the president.
So that's the backdrop from our perspective on what is happening. But what's driving all this? Does the West have a responsibility to step in and protect human rights, the so-called responsibility to protect? Payam Akhavan is a Canadian lawyer, a former UN prosecutor, and the chair in human rights at Massey College in Toronto. We caught up with him to get his perspective as an Iranian-Canadian. Payam, I'm sure you, like many in the Iranian diaspora community, are concerned about family and friends. With the phone lines down, with the internet out, have you been in contact with anyone?
It has been very difficult to get news from inside the country. There are some people who have access to Starlink, some people who convey news through even television broadcasts, which are acting as an intermediary between people in the diaspora and within the country. But what is most important is the collective sense of shock and grief among Iranians in the diaspora as they see the horrific scenes of violence, shoot-to-kill orders, the mounting body counts in the morgues of Iran. So it's a very difficult time for the Iranian community here in Canada.
We have various reports on the death count. The foreign minister of Iran gave an interview to Fox News saying, oh, no, it's not in the thousands. Maybe it's in the hundreds. He clearly was trying to do an interview to give send a message to the Trump administration via Fox News. But do you have any good sense of what the death count would actually be from the protests that have been rising up over the past several weeks?
Brian, it's very difficult, given the news blackout, to have any accurate numbers. The Iranian foreign minister's suggestion that the killings are in the hundreds, I think, is most probably off by a very wide margin. Another Iranian official had spoken about 2,000 people killed, and other relatively authoritative sources estimate that some 12,000 people have been killed. We have to bear in mind that there are millions of people on the streets, and that even if you look at some of the images of the various morgues where people are sifting through body bags to identify their children, one sees simply at those locations several hundred bodies. And of course, the government has every interest in trying to downplay the scale of the violence, but we have clear evidence that soldiers are using Kalashnikov rifles with shoot-to-kill orders against significant numbers of protesters.
Help people understand what the protests are about. This is different than the Green Revolution in 2009. We've been told that it started out over the state of the economy, inflation, the currency. What is it really about? Because, again, in that interview with the Fox News and the Iranian foreign minister, he said it was about Mossad. Mossad was the reason that things had turned violent, and Mossad was behind the unrest.
Well, I think that is an entirely unrealistic to say that Mossad is responsible for millions of people pouring out in the streets, for thousands of young people. The victims are overwhelmingly under 30 years of age, who are willing to stand in front of bullets and batons. This has been a long time in the making. Whatever the interests of foreign power, the Iranian people have had successive uprisings. Just in 2002, we had the Woman Life Liberty movement, once again, in which millions came because of the murder of Mahsa Amini, who failed to properly wear her hijab. Prior to that, we had the Aban uprisings. And the difference, perhaps, is that in 2009, the Green Movement was really about a contested election where the reformist candidate Mir Hossein Mousavi claimed to win. His supporters came out in the streets and they were met with terrific violence. And since then, more and more Iranians are giving up on the prospect of reform. They're giving up, sadly, on the prospect of a peaceful transition, because the circumstances are that they face not only oppression, and denial of their basic human rights, but they also now face economic catastrophe, which is in part the result of sanctions which have been imposed against Iran because of the nuclear program, but in significant measure because of the tremendous corruption in what is less a theocracy and more a kleptocracy. Massive amounts of oil wealth have ended up in the pockets of the economic mafia, many of which live here in Canada with significant investments. Massive amounts of funds have been given to Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis. And one of the chants of the people on the streets is that we don't care about Hamas or Hezbollah, we care about the people of Iran. We want a government that is responsive to the needs of the people. So I think the suggestion that Mossad or foreign agents are responsible for millions of people coming in the streets is not only inaccurate, it is insulting at a time when thousands of people have been butchered simply for wanting a better life.
And it is a country that could provide a better life. Your family left when you were a young boy. You left before the Iranian Revolution, but this was a country that at one point was quite prosperous, and people, the young people in the streets may not remember it, but others would. That this is a country that should be looking after its own people, not sending, people with fortunes to Canada or the United States, or to have more money going to the fighters in Hezbollah or the Houthis than are being spent on average people. Let me ask you about something that we used to talk about a lot in international affairs, and it seems to have faded away. Relates in some measure to what President Donald Trump has talked about in saying that he wants to stop the killing and he will respond if the regime does executions or carries out violence in the streets. And that's the responsibility to protect. We're not hearing about that a lot anymore, whether it's Iran or any other country. Is that still have cachet, responsibility to protect R2P?
Brian, I was working with the United Nations in the 1990s as a prosecutor with the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, for Rwanda, and that was the time when R2P emerged in the context of the NATO intervention in Kosovo. Since then, and I think the 1990s was a very promising period for international law, for human rights. We now live in a very different space. We've seen a very serious decline of the rule-oriented international order. We've seen the rise of authoritarianism, not least in the West. So now is really not a time when, as you put it, the idea of R2P has cachet. And of course, ultimately, we also have to realize that military interventions are not necessarily the best way to allow people to achieve a transition to democracy. And I think in the case of Iran, what is most important is to look at the millions that are pouring out in the streets, to listen to their chants, to listen to their wants, and to realize that, yes, R2P is important. The world has to stand with the people, but at the same time, all efforts should be made to avoid large-scale violence that could make the circumstances even worse.
Well, then, let me leave you with this. What can be done then? What can be done? What should be done? And how do you feel about the musings of President Trump, which at this point, as we talk, have been up and down? It's been threats, and they say, well, he seems to be holding off some of the executions. That's enough. Should Western countries intervene? Should anyone intervene? Or do you just make statements?
Well, I think that the Islamic Republic of Iran should be subject to pressures and isolation. The people of Iran need to be empowered. But I have no illusions that foreign powers have the best interests of the people of Iran at heart. It is famously said that nations don't have friends, they have interests. And it is conceivable that whether it's the Trump administration or any other government could strike a deal with the Islamic Republic that achieves their objectives while abandoning the people of Iran. So in that sense, I think we need to distinguish between the geopolitical rivalries and the pursuit of interests by foreign powers and the wishes of the people who are dying on the streets out of desperation, out of their desire for freedom.
Hopefully that freedom comes soon. Payam, thanks very much for your time. When we come back, a conversation with Kaveh Sharooz on the politics of the situation in Iran.
This is Tristan Hopper, the host of Canada Did What?, where we unpack the biggest, weirdest, and wildest political moments in Canadian history you thought you knew and tell you what really happened. Stick around at the end of the episode to hear a sample of one of our favorite episodes. If you don't want to stick around, make sure you subscribe to Canada Did What? Everywhere you get podcasts.
Kaveh Sharooz is a lawyer in Toronto and a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute in Ottawa. He previously was a senior policy advisor on human rights to Global Affairs Canada. We've spoken to Kaveh about Iran in the past and caught up with him again in Toronto. Kaveh, I'll ask you the question that I'm asking everyone with a connection to Iran. Have you been able to contact people inside the country as you watch the protests rise, as you hear about the communications shut down, whether it be internet or phone lines? Have you been in touch with anyone on the ground to find out if friends or family are safe, to find out what's actually going on?
I appreciate you asking. I personally have been unlucky. I've not been able to get through, but thankfully I know that my family is safe because other family members have managed for very short periods of time to connect with folks on the ground. But what they're hearing, even though thankfully my own family is safe, what they're hearing is that the situation is pretty bad. It's the regime has not held back its violence, and I think everyone's really frightened and very concerned.
And of course, there's many people who, in this country and outside of Iran, who are afraid to speak up because of what it may mean for their families. Speaking to a friend who just said, I don't want to say anything publicly because I'm worried about my mother, elderly mother, still in Tehran. I doubt that she's going to be on the streets, but you always do worry about the impact that any comment could have on family members.
Absolutely. What you're dealing with is a regime that is totalitarian in outlook. It's not enough that somebody leave the country so long as they speak out against this regime anywhere in the world. The regime holds their family members hostage and goes after them. It's certainly within the realm of possibility that somebody's elderly mother could be targeted by the regime because their son or grandchild or somebody spoke out even outside the country. This is what the Iranian people are up against.
What is your understanding of the reason for the protest now? There have been protests on and off over the years. We have heard that it is economic issues. Inflation is through the roof. There is an affordability crisis, which seems to take on a different context in every country around the world these days, but it's much more acute in Iran. We've also heard it's about water. Or the excuse from the foreign ministry, as I was mentioning earlier, that no, this is just Israel and Mossad fomenting dissent inside Iran. What's your understanding of this uprising and these protests?
Yeah, with the exception of this is fomented by Israel, which I think is rather silly. I think it's really all of the above, and all of them are deeply interconnected. So you've got an economy that is in crisis. It's cratering. People simply cannot put food on the table. They can't provide for their children. And they feel like they have nothing to lose at this point. But this economic crisis didn't come out of nowhere. It came from a government that is deeply corrupt. So corruption's an issue. It comes from a government that doesn't know how to manage because, anyone that has technocratic expertise has been pushed out. They've escaped the country. And now you've got people who are deeply incompetent trying to run the country. The country is under sanctions because this regime is deeply, deeply anti-Semitic and wants to destroy Israel. So it's been arming terrorists around the world. And so the country's economy is suffering. The economy is suffering because people don't have rights to speak. And on top of all this, as you said, this environmental crisis that's deepening, where the largest cities in the country are simply running out of water. People literally can't put food on the table and they can't drink water because there's no water to drink.
How are they running out of water? Explain that.
Well, this has been a problem a long time coming, and there are environmental activists that have been sounding the alarm for a long time and not being listened to. The country is running out of water because the water resources have been terribly managed. Dams have been built not because they are needed or they're not being built in the right places. They're being built because the Revolutionary Guards, aside from being a military force, are also an economic force, and they make money off of these kinds of development projects. Money that has been devoted to the environmental causes has been stolen, has been siphoned off, and either gone to someone's bank account in Switzerland, or they've been sent off to Hamas and Hezbollah. And so, and simply, as I was mentioning earlier, there's just gross incompetence. And so no one has taken this problem seriously in Iran's government. And suddenly they're faced with a crisis where the president has to go on television and say, we're thinking about moving the capital away from Tehran because Tehran is running out of water. This is the level of incompetence and corruption that Iranians are up against.
That is remarkable. And prior to the Islamic Revolution in 1979, didn't Israel work with Iran on water management and sharing some of their secrets and success? Because water in the desert is always an issue.
Absolutely. The Israelis have been great at the water issue, frankly, and there was strong relations, technical, diplomatic, and otherwise, between Israel and Iran. It's not to say that they had no problems. I mean, there were always diplomatic issues between two sovereign countries, but there was a great deal of cooperation, and that has disappeared. And we've ended up with a regime that can chant death to Israel, but it can't provide the most basic needs of its people. It's devoted all of its energy, rather than cooperating with Israelis who have the know-how, it's devoted all its energies to fighting Israel, and now is reaping the consequences of it.
Well, and of course, they've spent a lot of money and energy, devoted a ton of resources to undermining Western countries. And we know about the bot farms that online that have helped spread the message of Hamas or Hezbollah, that help undermine Israel. But it's not just that. And we saw an example of this over this last week when it was noted that when the communications were shut down in Iran, suddenly there were all these pro-Scottish independents social media accounts that went quiet because they couldn't post about why Scotland needs to leave the United Kingdom, why Scotland needs to be independent, how awful Britain is to the Scottish people. They were silent because the internet was down in Iran, not because it was down in Glasgow or Edinburgh.
Yeah, isn't that incredible? And I think it tells you something about the priorities of this regime and how it views itself. This is a regime that ultimately doesn't think of its top priority as protecting the Iranian people, providing for its people, or anything of that sort, anything that you would traditionally associate with the role of a government. This regime is fundamentally devoted to changing the world order, and that means attacking the West, attacking democracies. And if that means causing chaos in Scotland, then so be it. If it means supporting Russia and sending drones so that Russia can attack Ukraine, so be it. They're interested in sowing chaos in the West, aside from, exporting violence to places like Israel. And this is all part of one big project. And the sooner the world is rid of this regime, I think the better it will be everywhere in the world, including places you would not think of, like Scotland, for example.
Well, and of course, they spread disinformation here in Canada, in the United States, and elsewhere. It's interesting to watch some of the media coverage, and I'd love to hear your take. Is anyone getting the media coverage right? If we were to tune into Russia Today or Al Jazeera, well, then we would find out that these are peaceful protests, or that there are counter-protests to support the regime that are even bigger than the people in the streets calling for change. What about Western countries? Are the media in Canada, the United States, in Western Europe, are they getting it right? Are we too dismissive of what Al Jazeera and RT are saying as being just propaganda for the regime?
That's a good question. I think the Western media has been late to this story for one thing. I mean, these protests really have flared up in the last few days, but they've been going on for a long time. At least, we're coming up on almost 3 weeks now. These protests have been going on, and it took a long time for the story to work its way onto the front pages of, the New York Times or, our newspapers here in Canada. I don't quite know what the reason for that is, and also I should note that we don't see a ton of pushback, as you say, against the lies being put out by places like Al Jazeera or other Qatari-funded news sources and so on. And you also have this kind of far left media ecosystem that consistently lies and makes common cause with these Islamists. It's a really bad information space at the moment. I think there's a lot of efforts by bad actors to spread disinformation, to portray Iran's regime as more peaceful and protective of its citizens than it is, to whitewash what the Iranian regime does. And in the West, I think too much of our mainstream media has missed the Iran story for a long time. For a long time, we were fed this story about Iran's regime being able to reform. And somebody like me was going crazy trying to explain to Western journalists, like, no, there's something happening that you need to pay attention to. People are rejecting this reform movement. I think we're slowly coming around. I think people are slowly beginning to understand that, but I think the Western media still has a lot more to do on this.
I will defend my employer, Postmedia, that we've definitely been covering it from the beginning. Has it been on the front page of the Toronto Sun or National Post all the time? No. But there was a dearth, especially in broadcast, in terms of showing the images, and that was before the communication shutdown, when you could get television images out. It was noted, and it was noted by myself included, and lots of people online saying, why is there nothing about this? The people of Iran are being oppressed. I have not seen anything on campuses, Kaveh. Have you seen giant marches in the streets of Toronto or on campuses the way we did for, say, Gaza?
No, I mean, I've seen some marches, but those are by Iranians that are waving the flag and waving Canadian flags and expressing solidarity with Israel. In terms of students setting up tent cities, no, I have not seen that, which really does make you question the real commitment of these student activists to human rights. I mean, because the Iran story is one that doesn't fit very neatly. It's not a very clean story in terms of the bad guys being the United States and Israel, and the good guys being those that are Muslim. Here is purportedly Muslim population, or at least a population that has had Islam forced upon them, rising up against their oppressors, and they're attacking mosques. And what the reaction that you see from a lot of activists online is, well, this is clearly being paid for by the Mossad, as if Iranians themselves don't know that for 47 years they've been oppressed by Islamic thugs, that the mosques are where these thugs meet and come out and beat people to death. There is a real moral confusion, regrettably, among our leftist activist class.
Those mosques are the places where they would decide to beat on women that did not wear their hijab properly. And now you've got the iconic photos out there of Iranian women lighting their cigarettes with a photo of Ayatollah Khamenei on fire, and they're using that to light their cigarette with no hijab on. So they know where the oppression came from, and it was from the regime in Tehran and their proxies throughout the country.
Yeah, I see this the way folks that escaped the Soviet Union see leftists' attempts to portray the Soviet Union as a good actor in the world. It's this incredible, as I said earlier, this moral confusion about who the bad guys are, and the people that have actually suffered, be it under a Soviet system, a communist system, or under a theocratic system like Iranians. They are not confused. They know exactly who's been oppressing them. They're not interested in these identity politics games, and they're asking for solidarity. And it's very strange, in my view, that the left has not been offering this solidarity. Here's a left that talks constantly about the rights of women and LGBTQ people and workers and so on. And I think those are important rights to talk about. But you have in the Islamic Republic a regime that for 47 years has been targeting women and treating them as second-class citizens, has been going after workers and labor leaders, has been treating LGBTQ people as criminals. Every group that you can think of that the left is supposed to stand up for and protect, the Iranian regime has been targeting them, and yet the Western left still cannot find its moral compass and come to the side of the Iranian people.
And yet there was a post by Richard Grenell, who is Donald Trump's intermediary in a lot of different things, and he posted just the other day, "I helped sneak gays and lesbians out of Iran, and for the first time ever, someone has said, I want to wait just a bit. There's real hope coming from the inside. I don't think you can stop this now." He's a Republican. He's helping gays and Iranians escape the Islamic Republic regime and saying, look, they're now hopeful. We would expect that on the campus of U of T or UBC or McGill, there would be a chance to bring down the Ayatollahs and the mullahs because of their oppression of such people.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, if you actually care about the rights of gay and lesbians, and you're not in it purely for performative reasons, then you would be setting up some sort of underground railroad for Iranian gays and lesbians to be able to escape that country. You would be cheering on the downfall of the people that have been criminalizing gay and lesbian activity. You would be cheering on the downfall of a regime that in its constitution treats women as half of men. In its laws, it treats women as being worth, their lives being worth half of men. This is not a morally complex issue. And yet, so many of our activists on the left are completely morally confused about it.
Let me ask you about the issue of graft and the corruption, how that plays into the chants that we're hearing or were hearing when we could hear them in the streets of Iran, and how it relates back to Canada. So you mentioned earlier this is a very corrupt government, that the IRGC makes money off of building dams where they don't need them, or infrastructure projects that are questionable at best, and then they pocket the money. And we know many of them have come to Canada, and that's an issue you and I have talked about before. Those chants about, their kids living well off in Canada showed up in the protests. The people in the street know that we've been letting regime figures, key regime figures who got rich off of oppressing people, move to Toronto and Montreal and Vancouver and Calgary and live wonderful lives.
Yeah, what a terrible condemnation of Canadian policy that was. So this was a video that went around, as you mentioned, of Iranian protesters chanting, "Our children are dying here, their children are in Canada." Iran is not North Korea. Iranians have access to the internet. They have access to social media. They see the children of regime officials living lives of luxury in London and Paris, and increasingly in Toronto and Montreal and Calgary and Vancouver. Canada has regrettably, and this is quite frankly a bipartisan problem. This is not, I mean, the liberals, in my view, made it worse, but this problem actually regrettably started under Stephen Harper, who otherwise was actually great on Iran. We opened our doors to anyone that could come here as an investor, anyone that had the kind of money that could come here and buy a business or buy up real estate. And when you're dealing with a kleptocratic government like Iran's or Russia's, typically the types of people that can afford to come through the door that way are people that have ties to the regime. And so what's happened is, that immigration system, coupled with very, very poor due diligence on our part in terms of who's coming into the country, these things have come together and created a situation where you have people literally walking down the street and running into, the police chief of Tehran in Thornhill, just north of Toronto. It's shocking to me that no one in our, security system, intelligence system, immigration system ever bothered to Google this guy to see, who is he and why is he coming here? Why? And this has happened dozens of times, and there are reports that there are hundreds of these people here.
Kaveh, I am not shocked, because when we invited people in after the Rwandan genocide, people who were fleeing the genocide, we also let in the perpetrators, and they ended up living next to each other in the same neighborhoods, as often happens. And it's why when there was the mania to help more and more people, I mean, if you remember the 2015 election, and the war going on in Syria. And it started with, well, we'll take in so many thousands of Syrian refugees, and then it would be even more, and on and on and on it would go. And the initial plan was not to vet anyone before they got in. And I said, why would we not vet people? You're going to end up with the same thing we did in Rwanda, where we bring in people who are fleeing for their lives, and we bring in the people that they're fleeing from. And that's what we've also done with the Iranian community here in this country. Let's talk about regime change. I think that is, and I don't mean in the United States going in and changing the regime, although that could happen or they could contribute to it. How does the population get rid of the folks in charge now, and who replaces them? I know that you are not a big fan of Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi. He is setting himself up, I guess, as some sort of figurehead waiting in the wings. But how does Iran transition, hopefully back to what it was before in terms of freedom and ability? How it functions politically is up to the people, but how do they get back to freedom and away from an oppressive regime? How do they get rid of the guys in charge now?
Yeah, great question. So I think several things need to happen for this regime to fall. One is, I think, street protests, and you're seeing them on a mass scale now. Those are important, but those can be crushed pretty quickly. I think what will also take will be mass strikes, and this is something that happened in 1979 that brought down the monarchy and brought the Islamic government to power. The oil sector went on strike, and if the oil sector can go on strike again, if that can be coordinated, if those workers can be paid for their time on the picket lines, then the lifeblood of this regime is then affected, and the regime actually could collapse. And finally, I think what we're seeing is this is a regime that is not going to hesitate in terms of using brutality, in terms of shooting bullets into crowds. And so Iranian people are not armed. I don't think it would be a great idea to arm people, because once arms are out there, they become impossible to control, and the prospects of civil war increase. But this is the kind of thing that requires outside help. If the United States or if Israel can actually cripple the apparatus for repression that the Iranian regime uses, be it through cyber warfare or be it through very, very targeted assassinations or targeted bombings of, let's say, the intelligence ministry in Iran or the IRGC headquarters in Iran, those things can be really decisive. And I think those things in combination will be what brings the regime to its heels and will cause mass defections. I don't think, regrettably, based on how things are going right now, doesn't seem like we're going there. Doesn't seem like we're going to see the regime fall just yet. But revolutions take time, so I still hold out hope that we will prevail in the longer term.
Revolutions can always go sideways as well.
Yeah, Iran is actually Iran's today is actually the perfect illustration of that. The 1979 revolution went terribly wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, 1979, a lot of people did not expect it to end the way it did with the repression. It was supposed to be something else. The French Revolution went horribly wrong with the retribution and the killings and the guillotine. Are you concerned that that would happen again in Iran today?
I am not. Well, there are outcomes that frighten me. So, there could be a potential coup in Iran where the IRGC simply takes over. That's worrying to me. There could be separatist movements that use this chaos to try to tear the country apart. That worries me. I am not worried that the revolution itself, if the revolution was to succeed, that it would be taken over by bad people, simply because even though, I don't see anyone in the opposition that's actually taking part in this revolution that is worse than the Islamic regime. You earlier alluded to the fact that I am not a fan of the movement that the Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi has built, and I think that's true. But I also want to be fair. Despite my problems with him, despite the criticisms I have of him, I think any government led by the Crown Prince would be light years better than what we currently have. Now, I don't think it's the best that we can achieve, then that's kind of where the problem lies, and that's where my criticism comes in. We can talk about that if you're interested. But I still think the options on the table that would come from a revolution are considerably better. And the Iranian people themselves have been there, unlike 1979, where they were confused about what they wanted, where there were, a lot of Marxists in the mix that wanted to make Iran kind of a Soviet satellite state. None of that is in the mix. The revolutionaries are chanting for democracy. They're chanting for human rights. And that's what they're seeking. And I don't think anyone's going to be able to impose, any revolutionary is going to be able to impose a different system on them.
So let me ask you quickly about your problems with the Crown Prince then. What would they be? I understand your point that any government led by him would be far superior to what they have now, but what are your concerns?
Well, my concern is that the movement that Mr. Pahlavi has built, and I say this as someone that had been in touch with the Crown Prince, that knew him a little bit and knew his team and had worked with them. My understanding had always been that what he is interested in, what his team is interested in, is building a very broad coalition that brings together people from different ethnic groups, different points of view, and so on. But unfortunately, what I've observed in the last couple of years, and primarily this happens in Farsi, so if you were to actually observe them in English, you would hear them say very, very nice democratic things. But when you actually observe them in Farsi and read what they write and hear what they chant, you begin to see that what they're trying to put together is not a broad coalition, but a very narrow one of people that simply adhere to one worldview. So I'll give you an example, and this is one that I've used in other interviews. A very favorite chant of the Pahlavist crowd, and this is not a random chant. This is something that's echoed by the wife of the Crown Prince, by members of his team. They have a chant that doesn't translate very well into English, but roughly it translates into death to these three rotten groups. And they refer to the mullahs, they refer to the MEK, which is a militant sort of Islamic Marxist organization, and the leftists. So a core chant of this group is death to the leftists. Now, I am not a leftist. I think the left, as we've been talking about, there is a fair bit of moral confusion in the West and also the Iranian left. But the idea that a future regime would bring death to the leftists and would completely leave them out of the equation and leave them out of discussion, I think that's a problem. Supporters of Reza Pahlavi have been going on social media, attacking any Kurdish person that talks about the rights of the Kurdish minority, calling them separatists. Instead of trying to bring them into the tent, instead of trying to broaden their coalition, they have not done that. And I worry that a future regime led by the Crown Prince will actually end up isolating large segments of the Iranian population and many ethnic groups, like the Kurds, for example, that should really be welcomed.
Do the Americans under President Donald Trump or any other outside countries have a role to play in aiding, assisting, acting to help this revolution? There's long been criticism that had Barack Obama just expressed support or provided some support in 2009, that the Green Revolution would have succeeded. So Donald Trump intervening in international affairs is not seen by many as fondly as Barack Obama intervening. So what's your view on the prospect of Trump intervening in some way or offering support?
Yeah. So for those that know me or read my writing on social media, I am not a fan of Donald Trump. And I think he has done more harm than good in the United States and internationally. But in this one case, I think at least rhetorically, he's said all the right things. He's said that he wants the regime gone. He said that he's on the side of Iranian people, which has been wonderful. And I think almost universally by the protesters has been welcomed. Where I have criticisms, and I don't want to make them too harshly because who knows what tomorrow will bring with Donald Trump. It's always hard to predict the future, is that he gave a lot of encouragement to protesters to go out in the streets. Very early on in these protests, he said, the United States is locked and loaded and we're going to support you. Just a couple of days ago, he said, help is on the way to the protesters. And this encouraged a lot of people to go out in the streets thinking that the United States was actually actively going to get involved and was going to give them some sort of cover by either attacking, as I mentioned, the intelligence agency or carrying out a cyber attack, giving space for protesters to succeed. Unfortunately, he's not done that yet. And in fact, yesterday he was saying things that would suggest that perhaps he's not going to take any action. I see that as a betrayal. So certainly rhetorically, I welcome what President Trump has done, and I think there really is a role for the United States, but that rhetoric has to be backed up by action, which we have not yet seen.
All right, Kaveh, thanks so much for the time and the insight.
I really appreciate it, Brian. Thank you for staying with the story.
I hope this episode helps give you a better understanding of a very dynamic situation in Iran, one that could turn volatile at any moment. We'll continue to monitor the situation and hope for peace and freedom for the people of Iran in the near future. Full Comment is a post-media podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Prue, theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. Do remember to hit the subscribe button, leave us a comment or review, and tell your friends all about us. Until next time, thanks for listening. I'm Brian Lilly.
Here's that clip from Canada Did What? I promised you. But the late 1960s, you have members of the Montreal police who can spend their entire shift rushing from one FLQ bombing to another. Here's how New Year's Eve 1968 played out for Robert Cote, a member of the Montreal Police Bomb Squad, which put him at the forefront of fighting the FLQ during this period. He was supposed to be at home with his wife, who had just miscarried twin daughters. But instead, at 11 p.m., he's called out to Montreal City Hall to investigate a bomb that had just gone off. He's en route with sirens blaring when he's told, "Actually, don't bother with the exploded bomb. There's an unexploded bomb on the other side of City Hall you have to defuse." And then, right after snipping the wires on the City Hall bomb, Cote has to speed west, where a third bomb has just exploded outside a federal building.
The bombing started in April and May of 1963. That's when the first bombings took place. And the mailbox bombings were the most famous part of the whole thing, which was basically on the Thursday night and Friday night leading into the Victoria Day weekend in 1963. So, and initially they started attacking these symbols of federalism, federal institutions, whether it was the Montreal Post Office or a Revenue Canada. But the bombings escalated as time went on in terms of the size of the bombs and the powerfulness of these bombs.
If you want to hear the rest of the story, make sure you subscribe to Canada Did What? Everywhere you get your podcasts.